This year's budget is going to have far-reaching implications on your investments as you've never experienced in the past 10 years. The reimposition of the long-term capital gain tax can cost you more than you think. Is there a way out? Can we mitigate the impact? Well, we will talk about all these things in today's Investors Hangout, which is brought to you by Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Funds and Value Research. With me is the CEO of Value Research, Dividend Kumar. Dividend, welcome.
Thank you.
My name is Rajesh Lake, and my first question to Dividend is, you have been saying about the impact of the reimposed 10% capital gains will be much bigger. Yeah. How big?
It varies, but it will be bigger because one is that for all capital assets, what is normally the formula being taken is that your capital cost is always adjusted for the inflation. So if you buy something today, and you sell it 10 years later, the money would have become less worthy in the course of 10 years. So the cost cannot. So if you buy something for ₹1 lakh and sell it for ₹2 lakh 10 years later, your cost is not taken as ₹1 lakh. It is adjusted for the inflation, and then the difference between the sale price and that inflation adjusted cost price, the difference is on what you pay the taxes in case of this. So assuming that in a mutual fund your fund is growing by 12-13% and inflation is at 6%, so your real rate of return is just 6%, but you will be paying 10% of all the gains. So that is why I say that depending on the time frame, it could well be on a 10-15 year basis, you could well be paying 30-40% of your real gains. It is just not on the it's just not on the real gain, it is on all the gains, even the nominal gain. So you end up paying taxes on the inflation as well.
Okay. How about people have been talking about take out your funds and put it somewhere. What happens to the power of compounding in that case?
Yes, this is something which you have to be really careful about. Now you have to buy a fund, invest in a fund with a long-term view, because the more often you change it, the more often you make changes, you will be liable for paying the capital gains tax. So if you invest in a fund, take it out after 1 year, whatever be the gain, you are liable to pay taxes. If that gain is just 1 lakh or below, then not, else you have to pay the taxes. So what happens is, as a result of this, your capital keeps coming down periodically. Okay. So if you invest in a fund and hold it for a very long period, you don't have to necessarily sell it. Then it's growing, and because every time, assuming you have a 50% gain, and 50% gain you realize it immediately becomes 45%. You are liable to pay that 10% capital gains tax. So from there on, only assuming, let me give you an example. Your 100 rupee grows to 150 rupee, and you take that money out. So you are liable to pay 5 rupee tax on the 50 rupee gain. Okay. So from there on, only 145 rupee will be at work. If you don't take it out, your full 150 rupee will be at work. So as a result of this, we did this exercise.
So this is the illustration that we are showing you, and Dhiren will just quickly take you through that illustration.
If anybody would have invested in an equity fund and would have earned the average return which an Indian equity fund has earned over the last 25 years,
right,
and made those changes every 5 years, you buy a fund, hold it for 5 years, make some change,
okay,
and again after 5 years, you make some change, and you earned an average of anywhere between 13 to 14%, which any equity fund has delivered. Your total capital, if there was a long-term capital gains tax of 10% of the format which we have right now, you will have 10% less money as a result of that.
Okay.
So the long-term implication on a 12 to 13. So these are just illustrative number. It will vary depending on how your fund does and what is the time frame, how often you change. But I'm giving a very long-term general illustration that for a 25-year holding period, for a 25-year investment, making changes every 5 years, the cost and earning anywhere between 12 to 13%, which an average Indian equity fund has delivered, you will have 10% less money as compared to now what was the prevailing regime that it was exempt from capital gains.
So that's very well explained by Dhirendra. What about switching funds a few times? We are talking about compounding. We are saying that we lose money if we switch too often. But what can you do when the fund is underperforming? I mean, you have, no say in the matter, and you have to kind of switch the fund.
No, if it is inevitable, if you think that, it's important to be in well-performing fund, but at the same time be conscious that you are not at liberty. Earlier there was no penalty for making those changes. If you invested in a fund, after 1 year you realize that it's not making sense, or it's not doing as well as you thought it to be, or it is just not matching to your expectation, you could have made the changes, and there was no tax liability. No longer. So be conscious of it, and by being conscious of it, making some choice where the fund has greater flexibility. You don't have to worry about it. It will take care of itself. The likelihood of a fund, so one is that you have to be careful. Be careful about your fund selection, because you might have to hold it. Holding it for many years is more profitable now. You don't have to make necessarily, change your investment depending on the timing. So you need to be really focused on long-term selection which works for you, and you don't have to change, and that should have been the approach even earlier. Right. But now there is a penalty. You will be liable for the long-term capital gains tax, so be careful of that. And there are some ways in which you can deal with it. One is that to the extent of 1 lakh rupee annual tax, long-term capital gains generated in a financial year will be tax exempt. So to that extent, harvest that capital gains, because assuming that you are earning, you are going to make 5 lakh rupee in 5 years time, and of that 5 lakh rupee, about 1 lakh of rupees comes every year. I'm just giving an example, it's a hypothetical example. If you are able to realize this 1 lakh rupees every year and invest it again, you are not liable to pay any taxes. But if you realize all the investments, all your gains after 5 years, your 5 lakh rupee will be the gain, 1 lakh rupee will be the exempt limit. So 4 lakh rupees, on that you will pay 10%. So you can save that 40%, 40,000 rupees 5 years later. If you are, if you are able to realize a part of the gain up to 1 lakh rupees every year, but beyond that, don't make changes.
Okay, that's a smart way of mitigating.
I would call it, the impact capital gains harvesting on an annual basis to the tune of 1 lakh of rupees.
You can't do it to all your investments, can you?
You should not do it to all your investment, but this also presents you an opportunity to make a nominal change to your investment which you think is not doing well. And even with all your investment, assuming that you have 10 lakh rupees invested and it has grown to 11 lakh rupees, realize that 1 lakh rupee and invest it again. Realize capital as well as the gain and invest it again, so that you are able to shelter your gains from the capital gains tax in future.
Okay.
And it will be a perfectly legitimate thing, because that is provided in the tax laws.
Now, what role will the fund manager play now? When it comes to mitigating the impact of.
No, fund manager has no role, because mutual fund as a tax vehicle, it is tax exempt. The fund manager has no role in this. The fund manager should do his job the way he has been doing, do it better. Because he should, he should do it better. Of course, all fund managers should do better all the time, but fund manager has no say in all this, because fund as an investment vehicle remains tax sheltered. The fund manager never pays any taxes at his level. All the tax liability is for the investor, depending on his holding period.
Okay, but there's also no tax within the fund.
Yeah, so when a fund manager is buying and selling, there is absolutely no tax implication. All the tax implication is at the investor when he buys and sells his investments.
Okay, so we need to minimize the churn by not buying and selling frequently.
Yes.
Ourselves.
Yes.
Okay, and the second thing that you said, more time and effort intensive, and actually contrary to do less approach. That's the second thing that you mentioned. So this is these are two ways in which you can mitigate the impact of the LTCG impact. Okay, I've also heard that ULIPs, they're exempt.
Yeah. Yes, there is a different regulatory framework.
Should I rush to the ULIPs?
No, not really. They continue to remain. Most investors should not mix their insurance and investment for the same reason. It's a poor combination. You can't really, and the cost opaqueness and all those things remains disadvantages. At the same time, the need for insurance should be dealt with. It's a very important goal to be adequately and fairly insured, and that need changes dramatically, which cannot be met by ULIP anyway. So ULIP as an investment vehicle is not a great vehicle given its expenses and the lack of competitiveness, or the way it is structured and designed, and lack of objectivity in terms of you evaluating how it is doing. So it remains a poor combination. Don't mix insurance and investment. That's why you should avoid it.
For that, you have to have your term plan.
You must have your fund, your term plan. And mutual fund, despite this 10% capital gains tax, it remains the best vehicle to invest for the long term, because it provides you the diversification, it provides you the convenience. You can still do your SIP, you can still minimize your taxes with your SWP for your income needs. So all the conveniences, transparency, liquidity, diversification, great track record, efficient mechanism of buying and selling. So all those things actually make it and very intensely regulated. Okay. So all these things actually still makes it very attractive. It is little disadvantages. It's a small speed breaker that your returns will be reduced by 10%. Which was not the case in the past. We have just gotten used to not paying taxes.
So small 10% is what Dhiren is talking about. But a word of assurance, if you can give to our viewers at this point of time, it's not such a big deal. Relax. Do not.
Yeah, it does not really warrant any big change. Yes, you have to tactically change some few things. That don't invest in the dividend plan, but that is what we used to suggest anyway. Yeah. Be little. Careful with your investments, making investment, hold it for the long run. You have to, do some calculation in the month of March so that you are able to realize and do that capital gains harvesting every year, so that you are able to shelter a part of your gains completely from taxes. So these are 2-3 things which you should do. Of course, that actually adds to the complication. The capital gains harvesting bit, most investors will not be very comfortable doing it, because investors, generally tend to choose a fund, invest regularly, set up their SIP, maybe increase it sometimes. Once in a while, if they need the money, realize it, and now they'll have to worry a little bit about it. But it's important that your money grows. It is important that you are able to save with convenience, and on those fronts, I think mutual funds still remain the most compelling alternative for all individual investors.
So the first question of the day is by Ajit. When a mutual fund sells share, is it also liable to pay tax on short-term or long-term gains?
No, a mutual fund is a completely tax-sheltered entity. So when a fund manager buys or sells a share, he is not liable to pay short-term capital gains or long-term capital gains. Well, yes, mutual fund incurs one cost, which is of course the brokerage and securities transaction tax, which they pay. They're liable for. Short-term capital gains, long-term capital gains, they're completely exempt. All the liability is in the hands of investor, which is dependent on his period of holding. If you invest in a fund, invest in an equity fund and sell it before 1 year, you are liable for short-term capital gains of 15%. If you hold it for 1 year from now on, you are liable for long-term capital gains tax of 10%. In case of debt fund, all the gains realized before 3 years of holding is subject to, is added to your income, and you are taxed at your marginal rate. For holding of 3 years and above, the cost is indexed, and you are liable for 20% capital gains tax on the indexed gain.
Okay, our next question is from Arijit, and he says, I'm thinking to start investing in mutual funds through SIP for a long-term wealth creation, but after the budget, I'm in dilemma whether to invest or not. Should he or should he not?
No, don't be in dilemma. Invest with confidence. Get started.
Yes.
For wealth creation, you need to really contribute to it. And this budget, what it has done is that after, assuming that you start investing 5,000 rupees a month or 10,000 rupees a month, and you are investing a lakh of rupees in a year's time, and you will be investing, you'll increase your contribution of this investment by 10-15% every year. It becomes a habit. You will have wealth only if you work towards it. And mutual fund remains the most attractive vehicle. It will beat inflation, it will beat fixed income over a period of time. And this budget is not really hurting your interest substantially. Only after 10-15 years, 25 years, your small accumulation translates into something big. all the gains that you have accumulated over a period, assuming you do nothing, assuming you keep doing this regular investing, on 1 lakh rupee of annual investment, assuming the investment grows by 20%, which is 3 times or nearly little over 3 times than the fixed deposit rate that you will earn, there won't be any tax implication because all your gains will be less than 1 lakh rupees.
Right.
Then over 10, 15 years, 20 years, if you are passive about it, if you are not doing any capital gains harvesting, all this money will keep growing. And assuming you have accumulated, you have contributed 10 lakh rupee and the gains are 20 lakh rupees, your gains will get reduced to 18 lakh rupees. That's the worst case scenario. But it's important that you save. It's important that you invest. It's important that you invest in a manner that will grow well. It is well managed and it is growing well. And with all the convenience, it should not be an effort that really takes a lot of your time, attention, or if you don't have the inclination. So get started. Don't get bogged by this long-term capital gains tax.
Okay, next Chandrasekhar says, how will LTCG tax be applicable to each partial withdrawal from mutual fund investments?
Oh, it's very straightforward. All your investment withdrawal, all your redemptions, it will be seen, the principle being followed is first in, first out. So if you have invested over a period of time, your oldest units are redeemed first. And for calculating that, your date of redemption and date of purchase of those units, if it is more than 365 days, it will be considered long-term capital gains. If it is less than that, it will be short-term capital gains, which will be subject to 15% tax in an equity fund.
Okay. The next question is from Ajoy, and he says this is related to post-dividend distribution tax on equity funds. Should one opt for growth option rather than the dividend option?
Yes. In fact, even earlier it made sense because when you invest in equity, it's a long-term vehicle. The dividend yield on most equity fund will not be more than 6-7% or 8% of your investment that you make at that given point. So it makes sense to to be investing because equity is an accumulation vehicle. You invest for it to grow, and periodic income is not the goal when investing in equity. Now more so, because every time assuming the fund has a NAV of 15 rupees and it decides to pay a dividend of 10%, so the NAV will get reduced by 1 rupee because that's a 10% on the face value, and you will get a dividend of only 90 paisa. Because 10% of that, because dividend distribution tax has been clamped on equity funds dividend. So if you are in the growth plan, your 15 rupees will be at work. If you are in the dividend plan, then you will, 10 paisa will go towards capital gains tax the moment a fund pays a dividend.
Okay. Amin writes in, says, would it now be wise to increase the number of funds in the portfolio as a measure against poor performance of a random fund, as switching now attracts tax?
No. You need to be a little more careful about the fund that you invest and be careful with the fund based on all the effort or all the assessment that you can do that this fund is likely to do well over a full market cycle. Take a 5-7 years time frame, because all funds struggle at some point, but funds have track record that on a full market cycle they tend to do well if they have some essential things in place. A fund manager who has a proven history, it follows a process which is understandable, a clearly stated strategy. So based on that, make a selection. And of course, it should have, all these things should have been demonstrated in the past. So make that selection, because it's important for you to be, because if you choose too many funds, you won't be interested in many of them. You won't have a major say. It might also translate into too much of diversification. So I would say that put in some effort, have 3-4 funds, and that adequately actually fulfills the need of most investors. Having too many funds and to insulate yourself from the risk of choosing a poor performer or the likely impact of capital gains tax, don't do that. Choose good funds, invest regularly, don't get distracted by the long-term capital gains tax. Yes, you will have to change some tactics, choose the growth plan, choose the fund with greater flexibility, maybe avoiding the large caps and the small caps, because those are narrow objectives. And many a times it turns out to be a test of patience when a particular strategy or a particular segment of the market is not doing well.
Okay, Amit writes in, is there any provision in mutual funds to switch from equities to debt and vice versa without being charged, similar to NPS?
No. Every transaction, every time you switch from an equity to debt or debt to equity, the tax laws do not permit that. It is considered as a purchase and a new purchase or a sale every time you switch from an equity fund to a debt fund or vice versa. But there are funds which are called dynamic allocation funds, where every change happens, the fund decides to be invested more in equity or more in debt depending on the outlook for the market. Those dynamic allocation funds, they do it themselves, and you are not liable for any changes that is happening, the reallocation of assets that is happening. So consider those if you want to, but you are giving the discretionary choice to the fund manager to make those changes. You don't have a control on that. If you make those changes, you are liable for the taxes because it is considered as a fresh transaction.
Okay. I'm just simply going back to Amin's question where he asked about the increased number of funds in the portfolio. There, our LTCG harvesting would be difficult if you have a whole lot of funds in your portfolio.
Not really. Not
really? Okay.
In fact, you should, if you have to make some changes, assuming that you are investing say 3 lakh rupees in a year, 25,000 rupees a month by way of SIP. So 3 lakh rupees growing, and it earns 20%, and you dislike a particular fund. You are at liberty to make that changes, that money, assuming that a fund which you want to discontinue, and you have chosen 4 funds or 5 funds for this 25,000 rupee investment. So 60,000 rupees invested in one fund, and you are unhappy and you want to make that changes, and that fund has grown only 10% while others have grown 20%. For that reason itself you want to discontinue. You can discontinue, redeem the money after 1 year of individual investments, and you will still not be liable for those taxes, because if it is so this 1 lakh rupee exemption on long-term capital gains provides you some leeway to make those changes without any tax implication. But it is not an infinite one. Earlier the situation was that you can have a set of funds, hold it for 1 year, make all kind of changes, and it has no implication. So in that sense, be little careful, and as this money grows, after 4 years you will have greater constraint, because your gains will be larger, bigger. You will not have that much of headroom. So initial years, while you are accumulating, you have far greater flexibility, make those changes. Over years, maybe you can make, maybe after 5-7 years, with this magnitude of investment, you will still have reasonable flexibility for 4-5 years, and then you have to worry that making those changes, you will be realizing larger gains as your capital grows, and then it becomes a little difficult.
Okay, is this still a case for arbitrage funds? And this is a question by Amar.
Yeah, I will actually explain you what arbitrage fund is. Arbitrage fund was almost like a liquid fund in terms of return expectation, because they invest in equity, and these funds buy shares and sell an equity derivative at a future date, and whenever there is a difference in the price, a future is, and that normally translates into that is without assuming the risk of the equity market. You are realizing the gains, pocketing the gains between the mispricing of the two securities at any given point, and those are never big, hugely mispriced. That translates into a return, like it becomes the nature of these returns is like that of liquid fund. But because of this tax situation, that it is derived from equity and equity derivatives, it is treated as an equity investment, and earlier equity was completely tax free, so it made sense. If you realize 7% from arbitrage fund as compared to 7% from a liquid fund, 7% return from arbitrage fund after a year was completely tax free. 7% return from liquid fund was fully taxable, and it will be indexed and taxed at a lower rate only if you hold it for 3 years, which is normally not the case. Normally you invest in these funds as a short-term parking avenue. Even the dividend from arbitrage fund used to be tax free, because equity dividends are tax free. No longer, it will be subject to 10% dividend distribution tax. So in that sense, they are no longer attractive, because they were not hugely rewarding. It was a tax arbitrage, and it was giving. So the case for arbitrage fund as a safe, low yielding and efficient tax way, concessionally taxed, that is gone.
Okay. Our next question is from Amit. He says, are equity saving funds of any use given the LTCG?
Yes, maybe, because think of it as a simple allocation of the equity income funds are 35% equity, 35% arbitrage, and 35% fixed income, and it will be taxed at 10% for holding of over 1 year. If you are if you are actually setting up a systematic withdrawal plan on a equity savings fund, it will still make sense, because in case of a debt fund, one is that this 1/3 of the money in equity itself, with convenience and rebalancing without any tax implication, itself is advantageous. And because in the initial years you are principally taking your capital back, because most of the gain is still accruing, and after 1 year it will be taxed at 10% to the extent of the gains. There could still be a case for equity saving fund, but choose the growth plan and mount a SWP and have a limited withdrawal. And I don't know, over a period of time, depending on the state of inflation, maybe it loses its charm, but I think there will still be a marginal case for equity savings fund for its allocation, for the pure merit of its allocation, the way it is invested, the way it is managed. It's a conservative vehicle.
Well, it's not a write-off completely.
It's not a write-off.
Okay. Deepak writes in, should we change our assumptions for future returns in the wake of LTCG tax? If I have goals, say around 20 years from now, how much would it impact on returns?
I don't think you need to really change anything, because we don't have a choice about the tax being imposed. Old saying that debts and taxes you can't negotiate. So this is it. It's there, and it's not a very steep one. You will have, think of it, if your fund is going to give you 10% return, you will be left with only 9% gains. If your fund is giving 15% return, you will still have 13.5% return. So if the fund is giving 20% return, then you will be left with 18% return, because if your fund is giving 20 rupee, you will be left with 18 rupee. So it is good to be and it still remains a vehicle which will beat inflation. Beating inflation, being methodical about it, being disciplined, and having the convenience of being able to invest at will on demand. I think mutual funds merit continues, except that earlier we gotten used to completely tax-free gains from them. Yeah. That will get reduced by 10%. Get used to it, and we can't negotiate this. And just be a little careful with all the nuanced thing which I was referring to, that choose the growth plan, choose fund which you don't have to frequently change, do the capital gains harvesting.
And also rejig if you have, say, arbitrage fund.
Yeah, some of those funds, you have to really, but those are actually not mainstream funds. Okay. They were used by very sophisticated investors in a very tactical way.
Okay, last question of the day, and this is from Abhinav, and he says that how do we plan our long-term investments for 15 to 25 years between ULIP and mutual funds?
I would say that you should not compare it like this, because in 15 to 25 years time frame, our need for insurance changes dramatically, and when buying any insurance in any form, in a limited form through a ULIP or an endowment plan or a term insurance, I think first and foremost, insurance comes ahead of investments when you need it, because when you do not have any financial dependence, you don't need insurance. The moment you have any dependence, you need insurance, and then that need changes dramatically. The moment you have children, you need a much larger insurance. You have another child, you need much more. Then you buy a house on EMI or take a loan, you need an even larger one. And during this phase, as you start accumulating your savings and it grows to a point and you are paying your EMI, the need for reduced insurance happens. So, the need for insurance grows dramatically, and then, reduces steadily as you accumulate your savings and pay your debts. Insurance should be looked upon as a cost. So, it's a wrong comparison, and use mutual funds for investments. use different kind of mutual fund for different goals, you know, for short-term goals, the money that you need in 2-3 years time. Also, you know, the ULIPs are not sold based on their performance. I really wonder how it shapes up over a period of time. But the kind of variety and the expenses and the transparency and the competitiveness of this industry is entirely dependent on great performance in a sustainable way. ULIPs are never sold on insurance that, okay, here is a fund which has done exceedingly well for a variety of reasons, including low expenses. So don't compare. For your investment, get your term insurance, and for your investment, continue to use the mutual fund. Despite this 10% long-term capital gains tax, I think they will still be way ahead of others.
That's what Dividend is saying. Don't panic. Don't think too much about long-term capital gains. Instead, pay attention to the LTCG harvesting. Okay, that's a buzzword that he's given us today. Till we meet next time, I, Rajesh Lake, and Dhirendra Kumar are signing off. Keep investing.